Thank you very much, Melanie, for this very generous and gentle reminder of my age. I'm very glad to be with three, well, you are many around in this room, but three extraordinary strong women. Nancy, thank you very much for having the blue color on the U.S. Institute of Peace. It's no coincidence my choice of color for my tie today. And everything you have done, both out in the field, in the NGO community, and in USAID, and now as head of this wonderful organization. And then Melanie, great friend, but also a great colleague in developing ideas of prevention in particular, and peace building. And over the years, in different roles, we have worked together, and I'm sure we will continue to work together. And it's great to be with you. And Kristina Georgieva, a friend since some time when the humanitarian crisis were, which they still are, enormously difficult to deal with. We had this fantastic ally in the European Union when you were Commissioner for Humanitarian Affairs. And we're glad that you now are in charge of the financial portfolio, the vice president of that portfolio. You better be careful. The finance sector, you better have the friends in that area, and we're glad to have you there. So these three women, great leaders, probably are a sign of times, aren't they? We will see in the next few years or so where we will see women leaders take over in different parts of the world, and international organizations also, perhaps. There is a movement in a certain direction in my own organization. But I will not get into that sensitive subject now. I wondered whether I should begin on the dark side or the light side, the positive side. I say often that in the United Nations we are working in two perspectives. In fact, we are a mirror of two things. We are a mirror of the world as it is. And it's not a pretty place. But we are also a mirror reflection of the world as it should be. And I think our job is to reduce the gap between the world as it is and the world as it should be. And I expect from my colleagues to not put on rosy glasses when it comes to the world as it is. They should be very tough in their analysis, no illusions. But then we should never forget what the world should be. So, even to this second, I haven't decided whether I would start on the positive or negative. Any vote in favor? Okay, I start with the positive. I always carry the UN Charter in the pocket. I've had it here since 1984. This is my 12th version. And I think I will make it easy for myself, because I will read to you the preamble. To me, this is diplomatic poetry. It is what this is all about. And miraculously, these fantastic founders of this organization knew already that you have to combine peace and security with development, with human rights and the rule of law. In the preamble, they have the model already written. Now, listen. And by the way, there is no coincidence that the first three words are "we, the peoples." We talk about accountability. In my view, the accountability is vis-à-vis people. Can they have peace, development, human rights, rule of law? Anyway, this is how it is. And you probably know it. If not, I can send you copies. Rebecca, are you here? We'll make sure that you get copy. We just printed up a new, huge edition of Charters, 70th anniversary. We, the peoples of the United Nations, determined to save succeeding generations from the scourge of war, which twice in our lifetime has brought untold sorrow to mankind, and to reaffirm faith in fundamental human rights, in the dignity and worth of the human person, in the equal rights of men and women and of nations large and small. 3, to establish conditions under which justice and respect for the obligation arising from treaties and other sources of international law can be maintained, rule of law. And 4th, to promote social progress and better standards of life in larger freedom. You got all 4 elements in here. The same formula that I, as President of the General Assembly, had the great honor to gavel on the 16th of September 2005, when we stated, with the full support of all member states, and we remind them every day practically, that there is no peace without development, there is no development without peace, and there is none of the above without respect of human rights and the rule of law. 3 pillars on which the work of the United Nations and of work, in my view, of any society rest. If one of these pillars is weak, the other pillars are weak. There is no sequential analysis around this, that first you do peace and then you do development and then you do human rights. There was a theory about that in the 70s, believe it or not. No, you have to do it at the same time, because if we don't do that, the structure is weak. The 3 pillars have to be maintained and considered equally important. Now, of course, I have to paint that negative picture also, because to live up to this is not easy. I think we are facing huge problems. I've been around in diplomacy, as you understood from Melanie's introduction, for a long time. And I must admit that I have not found more of uncertainty in the world than it is today, the directions we are going. And I think we are faced with a huge challenge to prove that institutions can work, can succeed. Not only international institutions like United Nations and European Union, but also national institutions. Because if there is a lack of belief in institutions, in the democratic institutions in particular, and we don't deliver peace, development, and human rights, where do people go? In frustration. They go to find identity rather in a religious sect or a national identity or local identity, and then they divide, with the help of extremist groups, humanity into us and them. And there is a competition of brutality going on to bring in fear in societies, to divide us even more. So we have a tremendous task now to increase credibility of strength of both national and international institutions. In the 3 pillars, I can only mention the main challenges, because I think I want to focus at the end on the SDGs, particularly SDG 16. But in the first pillar, first area, it is, of course, the war in Syria, which is like an infected wound. There is another infected wound that Nancy just told about. We've had a conversation before on Israel-Palestine, of course. But the presently most dramatic situation is around Syria, where you ask yourself, what else does it take to come to the conclusion that this war has to be ended? Isn't it enough with seeing 250 million people being killed? Countries like Lebanon having every 3rd inhabitant being a refugee, ISIS, Daesh taking over territory in Syria and in Iraq, and refugees fleeing into Europe, destabilizing, and I'm sure Kristalina has a few words to say about that, at least in discussion later on, countries and dividing countries in Europe to a very dangerous degree. And possibly now having financing for these huge operations taken from the development budget, which would mean a blow to the development system in the United Nations, but also on the life in the ground in the developing countries. What else does it take to come to that conclusion? Fortunately, last week there was progress. I can't say no more, but at least we have the main actors around the table, including Russia and US, but also, as you saw, Iran and Saudi Arabia. And I just come back from a trip to those 2 countries, by the way. On development, I think human rights first, because I will want to end on development. Human rights, I think, is we have to sort of introduce a culture of human rights in the United Nations, but also in our societies. I feel that there is a need today to have a bit of a renaissance of the knowledge of international law. When in the Security Council there was a negotiation on access, humanitarian access in Syria, I, as a former humanitarian coordinator in the UN, found it extraordinary that they were actually negotiating elements that were part of humanitarian law, the Geneva Conventions. And I find that the Refugee Convention of 1951 is not known to those who now discuss refugee issues. And this charter, I could go on with the different chapters of this charter, particularly chapter 6, peaceful settlement disputes, or as it states more poetically, Pacific settlement disputes. How much do we do with that? In other words, we should show respect for what our predecessors in politics and diplomacy have achieved and be reminded of this, because we have this neglect and lack of knowledge, and even, as I said, competition of brutality as a sort of systematic way of spreading fear. We better be reminded of what we as a humanity have agreed after this horrible war. So we also have introduced something, and I'm very proud to be leading that on behalf of Secretary General Ban Ki-moon, and that is the Human Rights Upfront Initiative, which is meant to say that human rights are not only important in itself to be that third pillar, but it's also, why don't we, instead of waking up to a crisis in the humanitarian crisis stage or the peacekeeping stage, when houses are burning and people are dying, why don't we instead act on the human rights violations? Because the human rights violation is the first vibrations in the ground that things will go wrong. But that is often by countries considered interference in internal affairs, even if they know that this might end up in civil war or even regional wars. But we are pushing this ahead now. We hope we will get the support of member states to move in that direction and give warning about things that can go wrong. This is, to me, the life of a conflict. It's a very long distance between my two hands. But sometimes we tend to, CNN, even Security Council, tend to define the crisis here, forgetting there is a pre-side, prevention, and there is a post-side. If we start to understand that the life of a conflict is this long, and that we have an obligation to act both on the pre and post, then we make qualitative progress. Finally, to the last point, development. And I think the best news in this dark world that we have, after all these realities we are faced with in Syria, and the wars in Africa, and inequalities, and violations of human rights, and terrorism in combination with organized crime, etc., etc. I found it personally absolutely wonderful to, after 3.5 years of work on this negotiation process, see on the 26th of September this agreement on the Sustainable Development Goals, not in the presses, but preceded by a wonderful speech by His Holiness the Pope, Pope Francis. I think I went to bed with a smile that evening. I felt so good that, oh, we did it. We were hounded by the media that these goals are far too many, and they are too complex. But I say the world is complex, and we need to move to a new transformative stage of development. It's not the donor community vis-à-vis the recipients. It's a new world where development is, as Melanie says, universal. It's all of us. It's sustainability. It is a transformative change forward. We bring in elements of these goals that give a much richer, in my view, much more realistic view of what development will be like, namely bring in aspects like technology transfer, the migration issues, the urbanization issues, industrialization, and all these elements that are in there. And they force the UN system in a positive way, which I'm really waiting for, to work together, because these goals belong together, can be seen together. If you see them in the education cluster or the health cluster, or for instance, an area which I'm very interested in, water, you see that if you do water and sanitation right, you get good effects on child mortality, maternal health, education, gender equality, and poverty. In the present MDGs, 5 other goals are affected. So the new goals will bring about a more holistic, integrated approach. And Apart from the sustainability dimension that goes through all the goals, SDGs, the goal 16 has exactly that quality. That is on the importance of peaceful societies, which is the peace and security dimension. It is the access to justice and the inclusive, transparent institutions in the human rights dimensions. They connect to the model. So goal 16 will bring in this integrated approach. And it is a very important aspect of getting the goals into reality. I must tell you that unfortunately this was pretty controversial. In the negotiations, this was perhaps the most difficult of the goals to come to an agreement on. The word rule of law is not as part of the target. It is only it's not a goal, it's a target. It's lower down. Maybe it should have been in reverse. I will end with a personal example why that goal is so important. Sweden was, my country Sweden, was one of Europe's poorest countries in the 1920s. It was Sweden, Norway and Finland were down on the list, and conditions in my country, particularly in winters, were incredible. My aunt died in tuberculosis out of starvation, more or less. You couldn't believe that when you look at me, perhaps. I grew up in one room. I saw my first bathroom in life at age 10. None in my family had more than 7 years of education, ever, in the history of my family, both on my mother's and father's side. My father was a labor union leader, and at age 18, when I graduated from high school, as the first one in the family ever, I asked my father, what do you think was the reason why Sweden turned into this prosperous, well-functioning society as we were at the time? And he said in his words, which I now paraphrase, he didn't use the words that I use now, but he said approximately the following, three things, my son. First, in the 30s, we developed infrastructure. We loaned money to build railroads and roads, hospitals and schools, which later became a well-functioning public sector. And it gave jobs. I, as a metal worker, could get jobs in the 30s after the depression. And then, through the political changes in our country, education was given the absolute highest priority, so that every boy and girl could have a free education from grade 1 to university without paying 1 krona. And we put a lot of money into that system. And you, pointing to me, are the first one in our family to ever profit from that. And then thirdly, to come to the point on SDG 16, he said we had strong institutions, strong and honest institutions. We put our best people in the city administration. We put our friends in the state administrations and the government. They had to be really doing a good job. We were hounding them, and they were doing a good job. They did produce what we wanted. And he told me in the 50s, 2 elections were won by the party that promised higher taxes. They promised higher taxes, and they won the election. This doesn't exist today. But I just say to my friends in Africa, Asia, Latin America, when I tell my story, listen, if you don't have institutions, you don't have continuity of effort. You need to make sure that it is being built into your system, in your legal system, and your political system. So this is my introduction, far too long perhaps, but it was great to be here with you. It is great to be with you. And I look forward now to, I think it's Nancy who is introducing Kristalina, but great to see a full house discussing this very important subject. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you for that wonderful and inspiring recollection of the UN Charter. And for those who are interested, USIP actually published a book on your mediation style that, for those who are interested in the success that characterizes your approach. I am so happy to be able to welcome and introduce a good friend and colleague who is an exceptional leader. Kristalina Georgieva, who is currently the European Commission Vice President of Budget and Human Resources, where you oversee an enormous team, 33,000 staff members, 30 33,000 staff members, and the budget of the European Union, which is extraordinary. I know Kristalina from her years as the European Union's Commissioner on Humanitarian Aid and Crisis Response, where I spent a lot of time with Kristalina in official meetings where everybody had placards and was speaking in diplomatic terms until you got to Kristalina, where she shook up the room with passion, with energy, and reminded all of us what were we there to do. And because of that combination of her financial acumen, her leadership qualities, and her humanitarian passion and experience, she was asked by Secretary General Ban Ki-moon to serve as the chair of a panel on a high-level panel on humanitarian financing, and she has brought all those strands together with the usual extraordinary competence and vision that we expect of you. So please join me in welcoming Kristalina Georgieva.
Thank you very much, Nancy. It is a huge honor to speak after the Deputy Secretary General here, who has done in his life so much for the world and for us in Europe, not only in his own country. I would pick it up from him by looking at the world that we live in, first with a positive eye. Hey, it's a wonderful world. It is very wealthy for most people, $75 trillion economy of this planet. It has achieved, especially in the last decades, enormous advancements in technology, innovation, quality of life. Medicine today makes it already possible for us to live until we are 120 years of age, which sounds wonderful until we realize that you have to work until you're 100 years old for your pension, but that's on the side. I had a very wonderful experience with my granddaughter, telling her how life used to be. I said to her, when I was your age, we didn't have television and we didn't have computers. So she looks at me and says, so you only had iPads? And it makes you realize, that comment made me realize that the world has changed for so many things for the better. But it is also a more fragile world. Because of climate change, because of violent extremism, because of population growth in areas of this world that can least afford to take care of people, what we face is also exponential increase of children, women, and men who depend on others, on our goodwill, on the United Nations capabilities for their very survival. And these are the people who have least access to the high corridors of power. If they were a country with a population of 120 million, they would have been the 11th largest country in the world, just between Japan and Mexico. And in this country, half of the population, as Nancy said in the beginning, would be homeless. They would be displaced for no fault of their own. Most of the adults in this country would have no jobs, to sustain their families. They would depend on handouts. And majority of the children, and especially girls, would be out of school, no hope for the future. People living in fear. And I would like to talk about what is our obligation to the population of this country. Our first obligation is in a world so rich to spare the money for lives to be saved. No one should die or have their dignity destroyed just because of lack of money. Last year, the world was generous more than ever to the people in this country. We have spent, collectively registered in the UN tracking system, $25 billion. Just by comparison, in year 2000, we spent $2 billion. 12 times jump of funds. But also, never before has our generosity been so insufficient. The gap between needs and funding has never been so great. If you take a very simple measure of survival, which is $1 per person per day, we are about 15 billion short. And of course we can say, oh, 15 billion is a lot of money. Is it really? So our panel is charged with the task to come with very concrete suggestions of how we can close the gap. And we are leaving no stone unturned for that purpose. We look at what private sector can do. It is the least tapped resource today, mostly because we think of private sector as charity, and we don't think of how to capture the skills and capabilities, the innovation, the problem solving, the logistics that private sector can deliver on a larger scale. We look at the Islamic financing. Almost 90% of people who suffer because of conflicts live in Muslim societies. And yet we have not been able, and yet 75% of money that is raised comes from the so-called traditional donors, from the European Union, from the United States, Australia, Japan, Canada. So the question is how to make Islamic financing a more systematic source. How many of you are Muslims in the audience? I'm not actually, I shouldn't raise my hand. I'm an Orthodox Christian. Okay, so you know zakat. This is charity that Muslim people give. It is an obligation. Zakat last year, according to the Islamic Development Bank, raised $600 billion. If we take 1% of zakat to channel it to the people in that country, it would bring the gap almost by half down. And it is possible. We also want to see more responsibility from countries that are getting richer. More wealth, more responsibility. We are proposing as a panel to develop an index, we call it the Responsibility Index, that traces increase in income per capita and giving for development and humanitarian aid for the whole world to see. And I would say that there are many wealthy old economies that might find themselves a little embarrassed by the curves on this graph. We also want to see more financial innovation. If we can create financial instruments to make this economy be 75 trillion, we should be able to tap into that innovation, for example, by looking at large volume, high transaction, large volume activities like sports and entertainment, by bringing in this field the Google and the Facebook of this world with a tiny, teeny percentage of what goes through their pipelines, we can feed and educate and house and treat and protect the people in that country. And we also want to see how we can get individual giving to be more predictable, because we as people we actually are very often very generous, but we have one little problem to solve. Our generosity is usually driven by what we see in the 6 o'clock news or on the front pages of newspapers. Well, wonderful, but 90% of people who need help are in silent tragedies. They're not on the 6 o'clock news. These are the Central African republics of this world, forgotten. And for this forgotten crisis, we have to find a way to channel your empathy, your goodness to that cause. So we have a lot of work to do in this panel. We are hoping to complete our report in the beginning of December, and we hope to then take it on the road and make it bite, make it work. And we think this is so very important because it is morally right, but also because it is in our self-interest. Trouble travels, as we can see it in Europe now every day. In the month of October alone, there were 218,000 refugees, migrants, coming to Europe, seeking protection and better life opportunities. We also need it because in the world we live in, we just don't know what the future would bring. Some decades ago, we were the refugees. In 1951, the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugee Office was established for us, for the Europeans displaced by the Second World War. Who is to tell that it wouldn't be us someday in the future? Building solidarity among us in our family of nations is the only way we can brace for and face a more fragile world that inevitably lies ahead of us. So, how many of you believe that solidarity is absolutely paramount? Raise your hand. All the power to you. Thank you.
No, you're in the middle.
I'm
In the middle.
Yes,
Two ladies on both sides.
I like that.
that's right. Thank you both for setting the stage for us, for reminding us both about the absolute essentialness of the UN and the challenges as we move ahead. And you've both invoked the refugee crisis. And I'll ask you a couple of questions and then we'll open it up to the audience. So everybody be thinking if you want to come in on the conversation and ask some questions. But you know, there's a wonderful saying that says, never waste a crisis. And as I think we've both all discussed, the 60 million who are displaced right now, only a teeny fraction is actually reaching the shores of Europe and unsettling Europe to such a great degree. But it is bringing it to our attention. How do we use this moment to help to refocus energy and attention on where the roots are? And how do we use this moment to address that arc of conflict and fragility that is, you know, through the Middle East and Africa?
Well,
You're right. This is an opportunity, but we are in a hurry. We have to do it very soon. From the UN perspective, of course, we want to remind of the Refugee Convention 51. We want to remind of human rights instruments. We want to remind of the Charter and the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. We also want to remind of an analysis needing to focus both on the situation of countries of destination, the debate in Europe, countries of transit, Libya, Lebanon, Turkey, Jordan, and countries of origin. I think we are in quite a bit of a hurry to deal with the origin because this will continue to flow to a tremendous dangerous degree if we have these conflicts continuing. And I think this is probably one of the reasons why there is a little glimmer of hope of a political process starting, hopefully, in Syria. I'm not sure, but at least the driving force, as I said in my speech, is very, very strongly there. And also I can give you an example of how important it is to get the funding that Georgieva Kristalina was talking about for the operations. I think we are up, if we are lucky, we get 40% of the appeals now. That's if we are lucky. But I can give you an example of what it means that we don't have those resources to help, for instance, Lebanon to thrive or to take care of this. Every third person in Lebanon is a Syrian today. There was a family leaving Aleppo. It was a Norwegian foreign minister who told me 2 weeks ago. He was in Baalbek, Lebanon. He interviewed a family there. And the family had left Aleppo not only because of the bombings in Aleppo, but because of the fact that the 5 children, none of the 5 children was going to school since a year and a half back. Mm-hmm. And they felt so desperate about not next generation would have an education. So they fled to Baalbek, where they ended up in Lebanon, thinking that their 5 children would go to school in Baalbek. Not a chance. The schools were absolutely overcrowded, like the health clinics, and not to talk about jobs. So the possibility was that 2 of the 5 children might, in a year's time, get into a school in Baalbek. So what did they do? They took a boat, or whatever you call those vehicles, bringing them over to Greece, and then they were on the road to Macedonia, up to Serbia, whatever. This is the reality. In other words, the 2 reasons for the Syria flow is the war in Syria and the fact that we cannot provide decent life and not help the Lebanese, with the infrastructure need to do the job. But I think we definitely now have to organize this in a more structured way, and I think we will have a meeting on financing for Syria in February. I am in contact with the key people in the refugee community and our different organizations, including IOM, or International Organization of Migration, to see whether there is a need also for an international approach, because this is a problem not only for Syria and the Eastern European, the route is there now. Next week, I'm going there, by the way, to Malta. There's a meeting about the African flow from Sahel, Eritrea, up to Libya, and then up to via Italy mainly and Spain and Malta to Europe. And then there is the situation around Myanmar with the Rohingyas. And we have also in Central America, of course, the flow from Mexico, from Central Africa through Mexico, US. So we need to take this as an opportunity to really mobilize on finding a way to have institutions, apropos institutions importance, Goal 16, work in this new area, this new important area of the new global landscape.
Oh dear.
And Kristalina, you have a really unique vantage point as both a European commissioner and your role as the high-level panel chair.
I will start with the following. Coming from the humanitarian field, being a humanitarian commissioner, I put forward my first draft budget for 2016. And I'm a very big believer in focusing on limited number of top priorities. So the 3 priorities of our budget where there were significant increases were competitiveness, jobs and growth, especially for young people in Europe. Secondly, migration, being prepared for what I knew from my previous job was going to come, the slow tsunami of refugees pushed by the Syria crisis. And 3, for external action, and there we proposed 28.5% increase, the biggest ever proposed. What happened in March, when the refugees were still not such a visible threat? we got fairly good reception of the first, more money for jobs and growth. Lukewarm, but still acceptance for migration, and not much of acceptance for external action. I'm going back next week for our final budget negotiations, and we increased this significantly. We actually got from 4.5 billion euros in 2015, in the beginning of 2015, for dealing with the refugee crisis, to almost 10 billion now. Big chunk of that goes for external action. It goes for the neighboring countries. It goes for dealing with stabilizing these countries. And I believe that the acceptance in Europe is much higher because now it affects us. I regret to say that is how awareness is being built, but it is now being built. And the question is what we make out of this as an opportunity. First, it is the moment to engage our people in Europe, to understand that dealing with the root causes is not humanely much better, but it is also much cheaper. 10 euros spent in helping kids to go to school, or it is actually around 150 to 200 euros per kid to go to school, the refugee children. But spending this money serves as an anchor for the family, whereas when they come to Europe, the cost is 5, 10, 20 times more, depending on which country in Europe you go to. If you go to the country I come from, Bulgaria, the money that is made available is 150 euros per family. You go to Germany, it is 400 euros plus free lodging. It's a much wealthier country. So that getting people to recognize the value of the problem or the trouble or the visibility of what we are talking about in front of you. But that is not good enough, because helping people where they are is good. Not having them to flee their homes is even better. Best way to deal with our humanitarian gap is not to have humanitarian crisis in the first place. And that takes us to the tough job of conflict prevention, what you talked about on one side. And here is I have been beating my head on this question. If I decide to start a conflict in my home country, in Bulgaria, I get people to hate each other, and then they shoot each other, and then you come, mediate a peace, I probably would get a Nobel Prize for Peace for stopping the bloodshed. Mm-hmm. The question is how to have a Nobel Prize for Peace for not starting it to begin with. How to make prevention visible, and that's not an easy task. And I think we have to find more creativity, more imagination, maybe have a Nobel Prize for just being good.
I think people want to applaud that, so let's go ahead. I can tell you that all my colleagues here at USIP just gave that an applause as well, because that's a key part of our mandate and a part of something we struggle with. And let me just pick up on that, because Jan, you mentioned the very difficult effort to negotiate the Security Council resolution that was really about some basic provisions to provide humanitarian assistance during the Syrian war and to stop the barrel bombing. Yeah. And this was a long and difficult negotiation that essentially did nothing to stop the barrel bombing. This is something that the UN has struggled with. There was an effort to have the responsibility to protect several years back. And I guess the question is, as we look ahead, and certainly in the absence of the Nobel Prize that you just recommended, Kristalina, what do you see? What are the ways that the international community can find additional tools or levers to get in front of the terrible atrocities and the terrible ways that states abuse their own people.
Well, I'm on the same idea of prevention. My line on prevention is, did you ever see a headline in the press, first page or first news? The disaster did not occur. Or you go to a politician, and I was one myself, and you talk about something beyond your own mandate period. You have to do something now, because glassy eye is coming. When I asked about UN reform, I say there are two things we need. One is to introduce an absolutely concrete culture of prevention. And the second one is to learn that in today's world we have to go horizontal. We have to get away from the curse of the silos and see how we go across in order to reach results. So I think these are the two most important things to do, to do prevention. And I gave you one example that I rushed it in the end because I talked too long over there. But I have this, we are pushing this idea of human rights violations. Why don't we act on the human rights violation stage instead of waiting for the atrocities?
Yeah.
And if we get an acceptance of member states for that, so that they can understand that it is in order, it is their own life and self-interest to go along with it, that's fine. We did a few things. We opened the gates in South Sudan when Nuers and Dinkas were about to massacre each other in tens of thousands. We opened all our gates to bring them in. Yep. That was a late action prevention, but I'm not too proud of that because it was just a crisis situation. Central African Republic I'm more satisfied with because I had Rwanda in my eyes and said, listen, never, never, never again. So instead of leaving at that dangerous stage, there was the African Union troops. We were on the phone, Secretary and I, to 25 governments to ask them to come there. The French were there in good force, and the Europeans came. You were in that discussion. And in the end, we had a big increase of presence. It was bad enough in Central African Republic. It's still bad, by the way. But we did the contrary to Rwanda. But what I'm most proud of is that even the Nigerians now accept that we did a pretty good job in the Nigeria worst case scenario. After the elections, you could have seen Nigeria go into a huge crisis. And we did a lot of things in the spirit of human rights up front, including dialogue with the president who resigned in the end, other political leaders, discussions in this spirit. And I'm allowed now to say this in front of you. And the reason I think this is important, and Lynn Pascoe is there, you know what I talk about, for them to send the message that they find it legitimate for the UN to interfere, as some would say, in their internal affairs, is a qualitative step forward. But the Nigerians now say, we are grateful, we listened, and look, Nigeria is on its way to another reality. So if you could help us, and I look at particularly younger people, try to translate prevention to a concrete action plan. And I know Melanie and her colleagues are doing a great job on this, and I think your Alliance of Peace Building should also have a little subtitle, Alliance of Prevention, which you still have in your mind, I know.
I have 2 points to make here. One is responsibility to protect. One of the big achievements of the United Nations is to get everybody to agree that we as community have responsibility to protect people, including from their own governments. It is well thought through, but in the last years, we see less discussion on responsibility to protect. And of course, there is a reason for that, because in the minds of many, responsibility to protect is only associated with military action, protect via military means. But it need not be just by military means. And I have a very strong sense that we ought to use discussions to bring that back and think of the variety of ways in which we can act to protect people from undue harm. My second comment is, we have to actually work with the media on prevention. It would be wonderful, and maybe you can launch something in that direction through the US Institute of Peace, to get media partners and bring creativity on making the disaster did not happen interesting enough to be on the first page. How we do it, I think there is actually value of making it a competitive process. I'll tell you my story. You probably know it because we probably have been traveling together at that time. We had a very serious drought coming in the Sahel, and we can see it. We can see that it would be devastating. It was 2011. And then early, we all united to provide assistance to people before the drought is to hit. So we prevent tragedies. And I'm there in February, and a journalist, I say BBC journalist, interviews me. Has the camera, says, "Commissioner, how are you going to guarantee I will not be here in June to film starving children?" And I said, "Because I'm here in February, this is my guarantee." And then I asked him, "And how would you guarantee that if there are no starving children in June, you will come?" He was not there. And I am struggling with that, because we all understand that we have to make prevention, including prevention to death from natural disasters or conflict. We have to make it sexier, but how to do that? And again, I'm thinking of creating some kind of incentive to make the best prevention story on television or something. I mean, to get that moving.
We've noted the challenge, my USIP colleagues and I. A final question before we open it up, and that is, how wonderful it is that we're all talking about Goal 16, and that actually got included through some very tough negotiations, and that so many people know what Goal 16 is. How do we make it real? What do you see as the opportunities to really push that forward? Because that's the heartbeat. That's the heartbeat of how to make progress on a whole constellation of issues, and it won't be easy. What are the first steps?
I'm encouraged that there has never been more discussion about so-called implementation than on these SDGs. I'm asked, how is the UN system ready now? What do we do 1st of January? Is ECOSOC high-level political forum going to be the member states body watching over this? I say, we have now set the direction here, but we now have to make sure that this moves to the national level above all. The nation state need to take this over, make it part of the national planning, including number 16, of course, but it goes beyond governments. It requires, for instance, that parliaments now see that these goals are not affecting only development of foreign ministries' work side. It's energy, it's transportation, it's agriculture, it's environment, it's finance. So parliamentary committees have to see that there's no longer any sharp line between international and national. You need to involve the private sector, the enormous capacity that come from technology, from creating jobs, from innovations to deal with the situations in the health sector. And then, of course, the civil society and organizations like your own. Nobody can do everything, but everybody could do something. If these goals also could serve as a mobilization of good forces, then I think they are doing their job. So it's just that UN, yes, we have done this, and I really commend the member states. I'm impressed by the member states coming to this conclusion. But I think it has to be permeating, and nobody escapes responsibility. That is, I think, the main message.
I think the most important thing about Goal 16 is that it brings front and center the importance of rule of law and institutions. And you talked about it, that Sweden is rich because it has roads and schools and rule of law. I remember going to Haiti after the earthquake, and we traveled around, and I said to myself, the earthquake was horrible, but as horrible it was, it wasn't Haiti's biggest problem. Haiti's biggest problem then and now is what? Papa dog, baby dog, all the terrible governance of the country that actually deprives people from opportunities. I remember being in the car with our office driver, and I asked him, what advice would you give me, how we can help best? He says, don't give any money to the government. And then 3 years later, we went for the third anniversary with David Sharrock. He's here in the room. David Sharrock is in taxi going to the airport in New York. The taxi driver happens to be Haitian. So he asked him, we are going to Haiti. What is your advice? Taxi driver says, don't give any money to the government. Unless we actually recognize that Goal 16 is about peace and security, but they ain't gonna happen unless we build the institutions, the respect for the rule of law across the board, as tough as this is. And I think what we need is really looking at very seriously at the indicators, the capacity for us to measure progress, and then to have the bravery to speak truth to power. When you don't have it, we say it.
Amen to that. So I want to go to my partners in hosting this event for the right of first refusal on any questions. It's on. No? So if you do think of it, others in the audience who would like to comment, let's start over here. And then why don't you give the... No, down here. Go ahead. I'm going to take 3 questions.
Perfect.
Comments.
So we're here to celebrate the 70th birthday of the UN, and you've talked a lot about this generational change and what it means for youth people to be more involved, but also what it means to recognize the mistakes of the past and to look at the legacy, but also to look forward. And I wonder, in that, how do you see that same philosophy applying to a more profound change of the UN as an institution, of the UN as the way that things work inside, and also I cannot avoid but to think of the Security Council and the way it works right now.
Okay. And then the ambassador to Somalia.
Thank you very much. My name is Ahmed Awad. I'm the ambassador of Somalia. I thank USIP for inviting me to this wonderful evening. The 2 presentations, remarks by Christina and by Jan were inspiring, but I was moved also by their passion. Thank you very much. I have, Mr. Jan, I second your prescription for development, what made Sweden get to where it is. If I remember very well, and I didn't take note, infrastructure, education, and strong institutions. And I will ask you a question about what the UN could do about Somalia in that regard. I mean, Somalis may not be able to do for themselves what the Swedish did, but the question is, what can the UN do in those 3 areas? And I also subscribe to the what was the headline of the paper is no disaster happened. And Somalia is an example. Somalia is characterized in the minds of many people by 3 images: black hawk down, piracy, and terrorism, or Shabab. But Somalis, and thanks to the UN, Somalia has been without a state for 24 years, more than 24 years. But the Somali people, with their resilience, have survived these 25 years. Of course, with the help of many people, including the UN, the European Union, and all of that. I worked for the UN, by the way, in peace building in Sudan. In Darfur, yeah, and after you left, I've been there.
Oh, yeah.
So in 10 years, I worked in peace building, so I can relate to these institutions. But the point I'm making is that the good stories that could be written about Somalia overwhelm the bad things that are happening in Somalia. Many parts of Somalia, Somalis are resilient people, very entrepreneurial. We lead in many parts of the region in ventures in IT and all of that. So perhaps we should start for people to get Nobel prizes by reporting on the good things, the positive things that are happening in Somalia, and that could be reinforced. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Ambassador. And we'll take one more from the young woman who you took the microphone from.
Young woman.
Oh,
Well,
Can I have
okay,
this
go
one?
ahead, and then we'll go. We'll take four. Go ahead.
Excellent. My name is Rabin Pasha. I'm an Iraqi Kurdish refugee, and I wanted to thank, or I was an Iraqi Kurdish refugee, and I ended up working in development. I wanted to thank all three of you for bringing us to where we are today with this 70-year anniversary, and especially Ambassador Eliasson. I remember your work because I grew up in the Iran-Iraq War, and in 1988, and finally bringing that to a closure. A decade later, unfortunately, I was a refugee coming to the U.S., but a decade after that, I worked in the United Nations, and I was a part of writing the UNDAF. I want us to maybe actually bring the other two questions together, and the youth and the entrepreneurship. I want to pick up on that because I think that's really critical, and USIP has also done some great work in this regard. But as I look forward to 30 years from now, and hopefully most of us being able to celebrate the 100th year of the United Nations, I am deeply and gravely concerned by the generation right now that is growing up in these states, and especially the young people who have been failed by their states, by their public system, engaging them in governance, and by what they grow up to, which is a public system of employment, which is really deeply driving the financial issues and bringing a lot of despair to people, driving people to extremism, driving people to migration, all of those things. How can we build upon the hope and creative areas? And I'd love to hear from you in the business sectors, and making the case, and with youth and entrepreneurship as a way of driving hope. Because I deeply believe that hope is contagious, despair is not contagious, but the problem is that messages that fill the void and build on despair are very much like gasoline, and that's what's happening. And as you, Nancy, have very eloquently have talked about this arc, this arc has almost 70% of its population is under 30. These are the people who will be celebrating 100 years. How can we address them now, concretely? Thanks.
Thank you. And then final comment.
Thank you.
On this round.
My name is Lou Jane, and I am a biomedical engineering student at the George Washington University, so very close. Thank you so much for coming. And my question is, so when the beginning of demand for Syrian refugees came, many of us were happy that countries like Germany and Turkey were accepting large numbers. But we were disappointed and very surprised when many of the neighboring Arab countries, such as Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, Qatar, and the United Arab Emirates, who are very wealthy, were not even willing to take one Syrian refugee. So my question is, what were your hopes, basically, for these wealthy Gulf countries to accept Syrian refugees? And most important question is, what can the international community do to put these countries and have them do their responsible part and actually take charge? Thank you.
Great. Thank you. So,
You want to start?
who wants to start? Kristalina?
Okay, well, I'll start on the UN system. We have to be demanding from the system because the world demands from it. In other words, it's not a capricious demand for change. In our humanitarian financing panel, we will be making some recommendations for the humanitarian side of the system. But you are, of course, right that there is a lot to be expected from the Security Council because of the enormously important role it has in anticipating trouble, preventing conflicts, being decisive when conflicts take place, uniting the membership. And let's see how things would go. But there is a bit of a hopeful indication now with the sober realization that lack of decisive action has made the Syria crisis huge danger for all of us. It is a security problem not just for the neighbors, and certainly not just for Syria. Whether or not a specific crisis would unleash the potential for more profound change, we will see. But that change is a necessity, and it's a very healthy thing. That it's a scary thing too, but it is a healthy thing, and that we need the system to lean forward, and that is necessary also for the respect of the citizens of the world towards this system. On the question of what we do about the young people and how we create a more hopeful future for them. I mean, obviously, number one priority has to be figuring out how to generate more jobs, because no jobs, plenty of time on your hands, no hope, not very good things happen. But I also think that there is a very serious dilemma in messaging. Why? Because goodness is very quiet. Hate is very loud. How to make the voices of goodness to be amplified? And basically, that is on all of us. Speak up. Speak up. Unless we have no shame to say, good, bravo, and encourage the positive things to be spoken about, then we are in trouble. And unfortunately, we are wired as human beings to respond to trouble from the days when we were hiding in our caves from big animals, that we are supposedly hunting, but they hunt us. That is a problem. But we are smart, we can generate more positive. And I would finish with Somalia. My one and only trip to Somalia. We are landing on, it's not a strip, a piece of sort of field, landing there. And I would admit that you're right. We are all full of these prejudices. I see it's a tiny little plane, and I see from the window big Toyota trucks with machine guns on top, running towards us. And my reaction is, can we turn this plane and fly out? We walk out of the plane. People are welcoming us. They have very little, but they are there to share it with us. And then we went with them to a place where there was EU-funded activities. And we can see how proud people are of themselves in a fair way distributing what we have provided, in a fair way to their communities. So I came back with this story. I tried to tell this story to the media. They were not, from the moment, up to the moment with the machine guns, they were interested. From that moment on, much more difficult to sell. So here we are.
So,
well, quickly on reform UN, I think internally the most important thing is to work horizontally, that we see that we will be much more effective in the UN if we also bring in the other parts of the organization that can help achieve our goals. The SDGs will serve this purpose. Apart from the prevention reform, I think that's the most important thing. Security Council, enlargement of the Council, extremely difficult because it requires a veto, a charter change, which they can veto, the permanent members. What I think can be done is a reduction of the use of the veto. There's already proposals that veto should not be used in mass atrocity situations. I think one should consider to put the Security Council under pressure to deliver the resolutions. Kofi Annan, Lakhdar Brahimi, Staffan de Mistura, and some of us are paying the price for not having a strong Security Council resolution. If they are feeling, if they now at the end of the Cold War, and I hope it is really an end, could come to the conclusion that they should negotiate and come up with a resolution. This is what they are required to do according to the Charter, peace and maintain international peace and security. But they haven't negotiated because they were used during the Cold War to have these notorious vetoes. I say jokingly that the Security Council should work like the Catholic Church when they select popes. They should be locked up, and only when the white smoke comes up, they've done the resolution. It's my reform effort.
Excellent, excellent.
And then it's a very serious question about young people. By the way, when I was in Somalia, what has made the deepest impression my whole life, professional life, was being in Somalia 1992, 1993. It was the worst I've ever seen. It was the closest you can get to hell. It was worse than Darfur, worse than anything I've seen later. I still have these images in front of me. I was back last year or 2 years ago. It's an improvement, yes, but you have to still work with basic challenges of peace and security, development, and human rights, and institutions, in a society which doesn't have a tradition of a strong central government. That's one of your main challenges. But also to relate to the very good questions about young people. As I heard, you may confirm this is right, I heard 70% of the population is under the age of 30. But 70% is also the estimated youth unemployment rate in Mogadishu. If you add up those figures, even if it's 50 or 60, then you understand what dynamite we have into our societies, not least on the unemployment side. We have to give meaningful lives for people. We have to have a positive narrative, because this negative narrative has so much color, and when people are desperate, they go for these extremist variations. We have to understand that life is a journey where we take steps toward a better future. Dag Hammarskjöld, my mentor, not mentor, but my great, the person who means most for Swedish diplomats, but also UN diplomats, second Secretary General, he had a great way of describing the future. He said the future is two things. The future is the horizon, the vision. If you don't have a horizon and a vision, you can think about Middle East, for instance. If you don't have a horizon, if you don't have a vision for the future, you don't know where to go. But the future is also the step you take tomorrow. The step you take tomorrow has to be going in the direction of that vision. So you need to understand that, yes, we have a vision, but it's a hell of a job to get there. Thousands of small steps. And we have to do this journey together to build good societies. And that's where Goal 16 come in. Goal 16 simply tells us you've got to have institutions, you've got to access to justice, you have to understand you have to create peaceful societies. We must expect from our leaders that they deliver on peace, development, and human rights. That's the power of SDG 16. And I'm glad you detected a sort of element of passion in our presentation. I always say that without passion, nothing happens in life, on any level, I was about to say. But without compassion, the wrong things happen. Passion and compassion, keep that. Yep.
I am deeply sorry that we need to draw to a close, but I want to thank our partners this evening, the Alliance for Peace Building, the UN Association of the National Capital Association, and the President Woodrow Wilson House. It's wonderful working with you. I want to thank all of you for coming. I can tell looking out at the audience that a number of you are deeply engaged with these issues. Thank you for all that you do to keep us.
Thank you very much, Melanie, for this very generous and gentle reminder of my age. I'm very glad to be with three, well, you are many around in this room, but three extraordinary strong women. Nancy, thank you very much for having the blue color on the U.S. centerpiece. It's no coincidence my choice of color for my tie today. And everything you have done, both out in the field, in the NGO community, and in USAID, and now as head of this wonderful organization. And then Melanie, great friend, but also a great colleague in developing ideas of prevention in particular, and peace building. And over the years, in different roles, we have worked together, and I'm sure we will continue to work together. And it's great to be with you. And Kristalina Georgieva, a friend since some time when the humanitarian crises were, which they still are, enormously difficult to deal with. We had this fantastic ally in the European Union when you were Commissioner for Humanitarian Affairs. And we're glad that you now are in charge of the financial portfolio, the vice president of that portfolio. You know, you better be careful. The finance sector, you better have the friends in that area, and we're glad to have you there. So these three women, great leaders, probably are a sign of times, aren't they? We will see in the next few years or so where we will see women leaders take over in different parts of the world, and international organizations also, perhaps. You know, there is a movement in a certain direction in my own organization. But I will not get into that sensitive subject now. I wondered whether I should begin on the dark side or the light side, the positive side. I say often that in the United Nations we are working in two perspectives. In fact, we are reflecting, we are a mirror of two things. We are a mirror of the world as it is. And it's not a pretty place. But we are also a mirror reflection of the world as it should be. And I think our job is to reduce the gap between the world as it is and the world as it should be. And I expect from my colleagues to not put on rosy glasses when it comes to the world as it is. They should be very tough in their analysis, no illusions. But then we should never forget what the world should be. So, even to this second, I haven't decided whether I would start on the positive or negative. Any vote in favor? Okay, I start with the positive. I always carry the UN Charter in the pocket. I've had it here since 1984. This is my 12th version. And I think I will make it easy for myself, because I will read to you the preamble. To me, this is diplomatic poetry. It is what this is all about. And miraculously, these fantastic founders of this organization knew already that you have to combine peace and security with development, with human rights and the rule of law. In the preamble, they have the model already written. In the three pillars, I can only mention the main challenges, because I think I want to focus at the end on the SDGs, particularly SDG 16. But in the first pillar, first area, it is, of course, the war in Syria, which is like an infected wound. There is another infected wound that Nancy just told about. We've had a conversation before on Israel-Palestine, of course. But the presently most dramatic situation is around Syria, where you ask yourself, what else does it take to come to the conclusion that this war has to be ended? Isn't it enough with seeing 250 million people being killed? Countries like Lebanon having every third inhabitant being a refugee. ISIS, Daesh taking over territory in Syria and in Iraq. And refugees fleeing into Europe, destabilizing. And I'm sure Kristalina has a few words to say about that, at least in discussion later on. countries and dividing countries in Europe to a very dangerous degree. And possibly now having financing for these huge operations taken from the development budget, which would mean a blow to the development system in the United Nations, but also on the life in the ground in the developing countries. What else does it take to come to that conclusion? Fortunately, last week there was progress. I can't say no more, but at least we have the main actors around the table, including Russia and US, but also, as you saw, Iran and Saudi Arabia. And I just come back from a trip to those two countries, by the way. On development, I say human rights first because I would want to end on development. Human rights, I think, is, we have to sort of introduce a culture of human rights in the United Nations, but also in our societies. I feel that there is a need today to have a bit of a renaissance of the knowledge of international law. When in the Security Council, on which the work of the United Nations and the work, in my view, of any society rests, if one of these pillars is weak, the other pillars are weak. There is no sequential analysis around this, that first you do peace, and then you do development, and then you do human rights. There was a theory about that in the 70s, believe it or not. No, you have to do it at the same time. Because if we don't do that, the structure is weak. The three pillars have to be maintained and considered equally important. Now, of course, I have to paint that negative picture also, because to live up to this is not easy. I think we are facing huge problems. I've been around in diplomacy, as you understood from Melanie's introduction, for a long time. And I must admit that I have not found more of uncertainty in the world than it is today, the directions we are going. And I think we are faced with a huge challenge to prove that institutions can work, can succeed. Not only international institutions like United Nations and European Union, but also national institutions. Because if there is a lack of belief in institutions, in the democratic institutions in particular, and we don't deliver peace, development, and human rights, where do people go in frustration? They go to find identity rather in a religious sect or a national identity or local identity, and then they divide, with the help of extremist groups, humanity into us and them. And there is a competition of brutality going on to bring in fear in societies, to divide us even more. So we have a tremendous task now to increase credibility or strength of both national and international institutions. Now, listen. And by the way, there is no coincidence that the first three words are "we, the peoples." We talk about accountability. In my view, the accountability is vis-à-vis people. Can they have peace, development, human rights, rule of law? Anyway, this is how it is, and you probably know it. If not, I can send you copies. Rebecca, are you here? We'll make sure that you get copy. We just printed up a new, huge edition of Charters, 70th anniversary. We, the peoples of the United Nations, determined to save succeeding generations from the scourge of war, which twice in our lifetime has brought untold sorrow to mankind, and to reaffirm faith in fundamental human rights, in the dignity and worth of the human person, in the equal rights of men and women and of nations large and small. 3, to establish conditions under which justice and respect for the obligation arising from treaties and other sources of international law can be maintained, rule of law. And 4th, to promote social progress and better standards of life in larger freedom. You got all 4 elements in here. The same formula that I, as President of the General Assembly, had the great honor to gavel on the 16th of September 2005, when we stated, with the full support of all member states, and we remind them every day practically, that there is no peace without development, There is no development without peace, and there is none of the above without respect of human rights and the rule of law. 3 pillars